Hello and welcome to the channel. This is a video about an issue that I see among studies that are published today and that I often hear commentators getting all muddled up in their comments. It's about study size, what it is and what it isn't. Because there's a perception that a bigger study is a better study. By the end of this video, hopefully you'll understand what study size can and cannot do. If we look at the dermatology literature, it's common to see large studies. Often researchers go digging in large data sets with thousands of patients in the study sample. The databases are often insurance databases, population registries, and nowadays, international research databases like this one, the TriNetX Diamond Network, which has health records from hundreds of millions of patients. The implication is that by having a large data set, it somehow improves the quality of the study. First, a bit of background for those of you less familiar with medical studies. Let's say you want to know the rate of infection after a particular surgery. If you could measure the infection outcome in every patient who has ever had the procedure, you would have the real answer, the true outcome, so to speak. Of course, in real life, you can't measure the rate in every patient who has ever had the procedure. That's too many people. It wouldn't be practical or feasible. So you have to select a sample of patients. And whatever you measure as the answer in that sample of patients, we call this the point estimate, you think or assume your answer is close to the real answer. How close your estimate is in your study to the truth is going to depend on a lot of factors, like how representative your sample of patients are. In this talk, we're looking at one factor in this sample of patients, the sample size, and how it influences the estimate. It's easy to get into the trap of thinking that because you can only sample a proportion of patients, that sampling a bigger proportion is necessarily going to give you the more correct answer. Before I confuse you, let me clarify that this talk is about how the sample size influences measuring whatever it is you want to measure. It isn't a talk about how sample size influences the power of a study, which is the ability to detect a difference between groups. That's a talk for another day. But I mention it here because the terminology of statistics is one reason why there is confusion. When we say a study has more power to detect a difference between groups, it's easy to think that because a study is more powerful, it must mean it is better. Now, whatever you're interested in studying, you're going to measure something. And as soon as you measure things, there's going to be sources of error. Broadly speaking, we divide errors we encounter into two groups: random error and systematic errors. Random errors are just that. They're random. Sometimes high, sometimes low, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. Their error is in a random and unpredictable direction. Systematic errors, by contrast, what we call bias in epidemiology, are errors that go in one direction only, either too long or too short, but not both. They are inbuilt into the way you are measuring something, or the way you are selecting patients, or the way you are interpreting measurements, which leads us to the key terminology we use in epidemiology, the difference between accuracy and precision. In everyday English, the terms might mean similar things, but in science, they are very different. Precision relates to how repeatable results are and is influenced by random errors. Accuracy relates to how close your study measurements are to the true value and is influenced by systematic errors. The two are not related. When you make measurements, you can be precise but not accurate, accurate but not precise, neither accurate or precise. Obviously, the goal of every study is to be precise and accurate. And the really important point to emphasize is that when designing studies, the size of the study influences the precision, but not the accuracy. Here's a cartoon that will hopefully explain the difference between precision and accuracy better. In each target, the center of the target represents the true value of the population, the one we're trying to estimate. And the stars represent our measurements. If we take the mean of our measurements, then how accurate our measurements are will be how far we are from the center of the target. But how close or spread apart to each other the stars are gives us an idea about the precision of our measurements. So you can have varying combinations of precision and accuracy in studies. You might have heard of confidence intervals in statistics. Improving your precision tightens or narrows the confidence interval, giving you a more precise result. But it does nothing for accuracy. So you can end up being precisely right or precisely wrong. I'll say that again. In science, you can be precisely wrong. And this is a very dangerous study in the medical literature because it looks so good, but it's completely misleading you. It's precisely wrong. To illustrate this further, let's do a thought experiment. Let's say you want to measure the average height of an Australian. You can't measure every Australian, so you're going to select a sample of people, measure their heights, and then you're going to assume that whatever result you come up with is fairly close to the truth. One group of researchers has a lot of funding. They have a lot of time. They have an expensive laser that can measure height to 10 decimal places. And in designing their study, they decide to go to a primary school in Melbourne and measure the height of every child in that school. These researchers are going to get an answer. That answer is going to seem low, seem somehow not right. Now you start thinking, how can you fix this study? You think bigger studies are better? That the problem is sample size? Okay, what happens then if you go to every primary school in the whole of Australia? You increase the sample size 5 or 10 times. Does that give you a better answer? Of course not. Every subject that is being measured has an inbuilt systematic error that cannot be overcome no matter how big the study becomes. Increasing the sample size would improve the precision of your answer, but not the accuracy. You would be precisely wrong. By contrast, another group of researchers with less funding, less time, armed with nothing more than a ruler, would get an answer closer to the truth if they just stood next to a busy road and measured people over an hour. If they randomly choose people to measure, they are going to get random errors. Perhaps some people are in a basketball team, perhaps some are young families with babies. But over the hour, the random errors will start balancing each other out, and the researchers will get an answer that is probably closer to the truth. Now you might think this is a stupid example. Surely nobody would be silly enough to just go to primary schools alone if you wanted to measure the average height of an Australian. But once you understand these concepts, you will see this error being made time and again, only in more sophisticated fashion. If you want a real-world example of researchers doing a complicated study and publishing their results in a prestigious journal, please check out the video on this channel on my review of a melanoma sentinel node biopsy meta-analysis. You will see a concrete example of researchers pooling a large sample of patients together while ignoring glaring systematic bias and therefore reaching unreliable conclusions. Once you understand the difference between accuracy and precision in measurements, you will start to read the medical literature in a whole new light. I need to clarify that I'm not saying big studies are bad. Of course, all things being equal, a big study is always better than a smaller one because it improves precision. But in medical studies, how often can you truly say all things being equal? There is always so much variation in design, with so many variables to consider and compare. The point to make here is simply that having a big data set cannot overcome systematic biases built into the study, and that it's easy to be misled by an impressive study size. Whenever you see researchers discussing their study at the end of a paper, they list all the strengths, mention a few limitations, and then it seems like the number of strengths will outweigh the limitations, and that by presenting a balanced discussion, it somehow makes the study credible. Here's a newsflash. Science is not a democracy. Critical appraisal is not counting all the good points and subtracting all the bad ones and then thinking on balance it's a good paper. No, it only takes one critical error to make a whole study useless, regardless of how many good points there are. That's why it's so hard to do good studies. But that shouldn't make us accept bad ones. To be clear, when I say it only takes one critical error to make a study useless, I'm not suggesting studies need to be perfect, because no study can be. And if we expect perfection in studies, we're never going to read or use any studies, and that isn't going to be good for helping any patient. The important point is whether the error is important enough to materially affect the results. For example, take the issue of blinding. If you're going to do a study on treating meningococcemia, blinding isn't that important because untreated, you're going to die. On the other hand, if you're doing a study on neck pain, where lots of people get better spontaneously, or the severity of the pain is subjective, blinding is critical. So instead of thinking of blinding as good or bad, we need to assess how relevant it is to that particular study. That's what critical appraisal is, deciding how relevant variables are, not counting up the number of good and bad things in a study. I hope this brief video helps you appreciate the limitations of sample size and what it can or cannot do. Hopefully it makes you more wary of claims from researchers that seem to imply that just because the data set is bigger, it somehow means the results are good. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and as always, I'd appreciate your comments. Thanks for watching.